Marcus Williams stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a kingdom waiting to be conquered. At 35, he had built an empire in real estate development that made him one of the youngest billionaires in the country. His sharp jawline and piercing gray eyes had graced the covers of business magazines, and his name carried weight in every boardroom he entered. Power radiated from him like heat from a flame, and he wielded it with the precision of a master swordsman. The mahogany door to his office opened with a soft click. His assistant, Jennifer, entered with measured steps, her heels tapping a nervous rhythm on the marble floor. She had worked for him for 3 years and knew better than to interrupt his morning ritual of surveying his domain unless it was important. "Mr. Williams, the new marketing director has arrived for her first day. Should I send her in for the briefing?" Marcus turned slowly, his movements calculated to convey authority. Everything about Marcus Williams was deliberate. From the way he adjusted his Italian silk tie to the measured pace of his words. Control was not just something he exercised, it was woven into the very fabric of his being. "Give me 5 minutes, then send her in," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. As Jennifer retreated, Marcus returned to his desk, a massive piece of black granite that seemed more like a throne than office furniture. He pulled up the file on his computer. Sarah Chen, 28 years old, MBA from Wharton. Previous experience at 3 Fortune 500 companies. Her resume was impressive, but Marcus had hired her for reasons that extended beyond her professional qualifications. He had met her at a charity gala 3 months ago, and something about her had captured his attention in a way that few things did anymore. Sarah had been different from the usual crowd of social climbers and gold diggers who orbited his world. When he had approached her at the bar, she had looked him directly in the eye without the usual flutter of intimidation or calculated interest he was accustomed to seeing. Their conversation had been brief but memorable. She had challenged his opinions on market trends, corrected his assumptions about consumer behavior, and done it all with a subtle smile that suggested she found his confidence amusing rather than impressive. Marcus Williams was not a man who enjoyed being challenged. He was a man who conquered challenges, and Sarah Chen had become his newest acquisition target. The door opened again, and Sarah entered. She wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that managed to be both professional and subtly alluring. Her long black hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, and her dark eyes held the same steady confidence he remembered from their first meeting. She crossed the room with purposeful strides and extended her hand. "Mr. Williams, thank you for this opportunity. I'm excited to bring my experience to your marketing team." Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct. Marcus held her hand a moment longer than necessary, studying her face for any sign of the nervousness that usually accompanied first meetings in his office. He found none. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs facing his desk. He remained standing, a tactical choice that kept him physically above her, reinforcing the hierarchy. "I trust you've had time to review our current marketing strategies?" "I have," Sarah replied, settling into the chair with easy grace. "I've already identified several areas where I believe we can improve our ROI by at least 30% within the first quarter." "Ambitious," Marcus observed, moving to stand beside the window again, forcing her to turn slightly to maintain eye contact. Another power play. "I appreciate ambition, but I should make something clear from the start. I run a very particular type of organization here. Every department, every employee operates according to my vision. Creative independence is encouraged, but only within the parameters I establish." Sarah nodded, her expression neutral. "I understand. Your success speaks for itself. I'm here to execute your vision with excellence." The words were right, but something in her tone made Marcus pause. There was a quality to her voice, a subtle undercurrent that he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't defiance exactly, But it wasn't submission either. It was as if she were playing a game whose rules only she knew. Over the following weeks, Marcus orchestrated his campaign with the same ruthless efficiency he brought to his business dealings. He scheduled unnecessary one-on-one meetings that ran past normal working hours. He found reasons to include her in high-level strategic sessions that were outside her departmental purview. He made sure she accompanied him to client dinners and industry events, always positioning it as professional development. Sarah never complained. She arrived early, stayed late, and delivered exceptional work that even Marcus had to admit exceeded his high expectations. Her marketing campaigns were innovative, her presentations flawless, and her ability to read client needs uncanny. Within a month, she had become indispensable to several major accounts. But it was the personal moments that Marcus savored most. The way she would tuck a strand of hair behind her ear when concentrating on a problem. The slight furrow of her brow when she disagreed with something but was too professional to voice it immediately. The way she would pause just for a second before answering his more personal questions, as if carefully considering how much of herself to reveal. "Tell me about your family," he said one evening as they sat in his office reviewing campaign metrics. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Sarah looked up from her laptop, that familiar pause preceding her response. "Not much to tell. My parents immigrated from Taiwan when I was 3. They run a small restaurant in Queens. Very traditional, very hardworking." "They must be proud of your success," Marcus probed, leaning back in his chair. "They are," she said simply, returning her attention to the screen. Marcus was not accustomed to such brief responses to his questions. Most people, when given his attention, babbled nervously, oversharing in their eagerness to please or impress. Sarah's restraint only intensified his interest. She was a puzzle, and Marcus Williams had never met a puzzle he couldn't solve. He began to escalate his approach. The professional boundaries he had initially maintained began to blur. He would stand closer during presentations, his hand occasionally brushing her shoulder as he pointed to something on a screen. He scheduled working lunches at increasingly intimate restaurants. He began texting her outside of work hours, first about business matters, then gradually shifting to more personal topics. Sarah navigated each escalation with remarkable skill. She maintained perfect professionalism while never quite rebuffing his advances. She would respond to his texts promptly but briefly. She would accept his lunch invitations but always steer conversations back to work. She was playing the game, but by rules that seemed designed to keep him perpetually off balance. One evening, after a particularly successful client presentation, Marcus suggested they celebrate with drinks at his private club. Sarah accepted, and for the first time, Marcus felt the thrill of impending victory. The club was his territory, a place where his power was absolute and unquestioned. They sat in a corner booth, the leather seats positioning them closer than office furniture would allow. Marcus ordered a bottle of champagne that cost more than most people's monthly salary, pouring it with practiced elegance. "To success," he toasted, his eyes locked on hers. "To success," she echoed, taking a measured sip. "You know, Sarah," Marcus began, his voice dropping to a more intimate register, "I've built everything you see around us. This club, half the building's visible from that window, the company that employs over 5,000 people. But lately, I find myself thinking that none of it means as much as the moments I spend with you." It was a line he had used before, with minor variations, on other women. But as he spoke the words to Sarah, he realized with some surprise that he actually meant them. Somewhere in his calculated pursuit, genuine feeling had crept in like an unexpected variable in a carefully balanced equation. Sarah set down her glass and looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. For a long moment, she was silent, and Marcus felt an unfamiliar flutter of uncertainty in his chest. "Marcus," she said finally, using his first name for the first time. "You're an remarkable man. What you've built is truly impressive. But I need you to understand something. I took this job because it was an incredible opportunity. I've stayed because I love the work and I'm good at it. Nothing more." The words were delivered gently, but they landed like blows. Marcus Williams was not a man who heard the word no. He was not a man who failed to get what he wanted, and he was certainly not a man who accepted rejection from someone he had hired, someone whose career he controlled. "I think you're misunderstanding the situation," he said, his voice hardening slightly. "I'm offering you more than just a job. I'm offering you a life most women would kill for. Private jets, penthouses, designer everything. All you have to do is be smart about this." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. The careful neutrality she had maintained for weeks cracked just slightly, revealing something harder beneath. "And if I'm not interested in being smart about this?" she asked quietly. Marcus leaned back, a cold smile playing at his lips. "Then I would have to question whether you're really the right fit for our organization. It would be a shame to lose such a talented marketing director, but I'm sure you understand that cultural fit is just as important as skill set." The threat hung in the air between them like a blade. Marcus had played this card before, with other women who had initially resisted his advances. They always capitulated eventually, choosing their careers over their principles. It was simply a matter of applying the right pressure. But Sarah did something unexpected. She smiled, not the polite, professional smile he was accustomed to, but something altogether different. It was the smile of someone who held cards he couldn't see. "I understand perfectly," she said, finishing her champagne in one smooth motion. "Thank you for the drink, Marcus. I'll see you in the office tomorrow." She stood to leave, and Marcus felt compelled to reassert control. "Sarah, I don't think you fully grasp what you're walking away from, or what you're risking." She paused at the edge of the booth, looking down at him with that same unreadable expression. "Oh, I grasp it perfectly. The question is whether you do. Good night, Marcus." As she walked away, her heels clicking confidently across the marble floor, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years: doubt. He had expected her to crumble under the threat to her career. He had expected tears or pleas or eventual submission. He had not expected her to smile and walk away as if she knew something he didn't. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the office earlier than usual, determined to regain the upper hand. He would make Sarah's life difficult enough that she would come to him, apologizing for her behavior and ready to be reasonable. It was a strategy that had never failed him before. But when he reached his office, he found Sarah already there, sitting in one of his chairs with a cup of coffee and a stack of files. She looked up as he entered, that same mysterious smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Good morning, Marcus. We need to talk about the Henderson account." Her tone was perfectly professional, as if the previous evening had never happened. Marcus felt wrong-footed again, but he refused to show it. He moved to his desk, using the familiar position of power to steady himself. "The Henderson account can wait," he said coldly. "We need to discuss your future with this company." "No," Sarah said simply. "We don't. The Henderson account is worth $50 million to your company. Your behavior last night is worth considerably less. So let's focus on what matters, shall we?" The audacity of her response left Marcus momentarily speechless. No one spoke to him this way. No one dismissed his threats as if they were minor inconveniences. He felt rage building in his chest, the kind of volcanic anger that had destroyed careers and toppled competitors. "You seem to be under the impression that you have some kind of leverage here," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Let me be crystal clear. I own this company. I own your career. And by the end of this week, you'll either understand that, or you'll be looking for a new job. And I promise you, Sarah, I have enough influence to make sure that job won't be anywhere worth working." Sarah stood slowly, gathering her files with unhurried movements. When she looked at him, there was something almost pitying in her expression. "You really don't know, do you?" she said softly. "All this time, and you never bothered to really investigate who I am. You saw what you wanted to see, a pretty face, an impressive resume, someone you could add to your collection, but you never looked deeper." "What are you talking about?" Marcus demanded, but for the first time he felt a creeping sense of unease. Sarah moved to the door, then paused, turning back to face him. "My maiden name isn't Chen. Marcus, it's Zhang, Sarah Zhang. Perhaps that means something to you?" The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Zhang, as in William Zhang, the reclusive billionaire whose real estate empire dwarfed even Marcus's considerable holdings. William Zhang, who operated from the shadows, whose influence extended into every major market in the country. William Zhang, who was known for his fierce protection of his family and his ruthless destruction of anyone who crossed them. "You're—" Marcus couldn't finish the sentence. "His daughter," Sarah confirmed, her smile now showing teeth. "Married name Chen, which I kept after my divorce because I valued the anonymity it provided. I wanted to see if I could succeed on my own merits, without my father's name opening doors. And I have. But I'm also not someone who tolerates being threatened or treated like property." Marcus felt the blood draining from his face. The implications crashed over him in waves. Every threat he had made, every power play he had attempted, had been against the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the country, a man known for destroying those who wronged him or his family. "Sarah, he began, but she held up a hand. "You're going to transfer me to the New York office with a 50% raise and a written guarantee of no retaliation. You're going to provide a glowing recommendation letter, and you're never going to contact me outside of necessary business communications again. And if I refuse?" The question was reflexive, though Marcus already knew he had no real choice. Sarah's smile widened. "Then my father will be very interested to hear about how you've been treating his daughter, how you threatened her career, how you tried to coerce her into a relationship. He's quite protective, you know, and he has such interesting friends in regulatory agencies, among other places." Marcus slumped in his chair, the weight of his miscalculation crushing down on him. In his arrogance, he had seen only what he wanted to see. He had pursued her like she was prey, never realizing he was the one being hunted. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why let it go this far? You could have told me who you were from the beginning." Sarah considered the question, her expression thoughtful. "Because I wanted to see who you really were. My father warned me about men like you, but I wanted to give you the benefit of the doubt. I thought maybe underneath the power games and the manipulation, there might be something worth knowing. I was wrong." She turned to leave, then paused one last time. "The transfer papers will be on your desk by noon. I expect them signed and processed by end of business today. Oh, and Marcus? My father sends his regards. He's been following my career here with great interest." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like finality. Marcus sat alone in his office, surrounded by all the trappings of power that suddenly felt as substantial as smoke. He had thought he owned her, thought he could manipulate and control her like every other acquisition in his life. But in the end, she had destroyed him with a simple truth he had been too arrogant to see. The hunter had been the hunted all along, and his revelation of her true identity had shattered his carefully constructed world in seconds. He reached for his phone with trembling hands, knowing he had to sign those transfer papers and hope that Sarah Zhang was more merciful than her father would be. His empire, built on control and domination, suddenly felt as fragile as glass, ready to shatter at the slightest pressure from forces far greater than his own. The transfer papers arrived at Marcus Williams's desk at exactly noon, just as Sarah had promised. They sat there like a verdict, crisp white pages that represented his complete capitulation. His hands shook slightly as he signed them, each stroke of the pen feeling like another crack in the facade of invincibility he had spent years constructing. Jennifer knocked tentatively before entering. She had worked for Marcus long enough to read his moods, and the atmosphere in the office was electric with tension. "Mr. Williams, the papers for Ms. Chen's transfer have been processed. HR is asking about the raise authorization." "It's approved," Marcus said curtly, not looking up from his computer screen where he was researching everything he could find about William Zhang. The more he read, the more his stomach churned. Zhang's reach extended far beyond what Marcus had imagined. Real estate was just the visible tip of an empire that included shipping, technology, and investments in dozens of major corporations. Most troubling were the stories of what happened to those who crossed him. Businesses destroyed, careers ended, entire families financially ruined. "Sir, there's also a William Zhang holding on line 1. He says it's personal." The words hit Marcus like ice water. He stared at the blinking light on his phone for a long moment, considering his options. There were none. With a deep breath, he picked up the receiver. "Mr. Zhang," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Mr. Williams." The voice on the other end was calm, cultured, with just a trace of an accent. "I understand you've been working closely with my daughter." "Yes, sir. She's been an exceptional addition to our marketing team." "I'm glad to hear it. Sarah tells me she's transferring to your New York office. I trust there won't be any complications with this transition?" The implicit threat in the politely worded question was clear. Marcus swallowed hard. "None whatsoever. We're sorry to lose her from the Los Angeles team, but her career advancement is our priority." "How refreshing," Zhang said, and Marcus could hear the smile in his voice. It was not a pleasant sound. "You know, Mr. Williams, I've been watching your career for some time. You've built something impressive. It would be a shame if anything were to happen to it." "I understand," Marcus managed. "Do you? I wonder. You see, Sarah is my only daughter. She insisted on making her own way in the world, and I respected that. But I've always kept a close eye on her. Imagine my surprise when I learned about your interest in her." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling sweat beading on his forehead. "Mr. Zhang, I apologize for any—" "No," Zhang interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade. "You apologize for nothing. An apology implies a simple mistake, a misunderstanding that can be forgiven and forgotten. What you did was calculated, predatory. You saw my daughter as an acquisition, a thing to be owned. That is not something I forgive." "What do you want?" Marcus asked, abandoning pretense. His voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. "For now, nothing. Sarah has asked me to let the matter drop, and I respect her wishes. But understand this, Mr. Williams. You exist now at my discretion. Your business, your reputation, your entire world continues only because my daughter is more merciful than I am. If you ever forget that, if you ever attempt to contact her beyond what is professionally necessary, if you even think about retaliation, well, I'm sure a smart man like you can imagine the consequences." The line went dead. Marcus set the phone down with exaggerated care, as if sudden movements might shatter something. He stood and walked to his window, looking out at the city he had once felt he owned. Now it seemed foreign, full of shadows and threats he had been too arrogant to see. Over the following days, Marcus tried to return to normal operations, but paranoia crept into every interaction. When a major investor suddenly pulled out of a development project, he wondered if it was Zhang's influence. When a regulatory review of one of his properties seemed more thorough than usual, he saw hidden hands at work. The empire he had built on certainty and control now felt like a house of cards in a windstorm. His senior staff noticed the change. Marcus, who had once commanded meetings with absolute authority, now seemed distracted, uncertain. He second-guessed decisions he would have made without hesitation weeks before. He avoided the very client dinners and power lunches that had been his staging grounds for dominance. 3 weeks after Sarah's departure, Marcus received an invitation that made his blood run cold. It was for a charity gala, the same annual event where he had first met Sarah. The invitation was standard, but attached was a handwritten note. "I do hope you'll attend. It would be good to catch up. SZ." Marcus stared at the note, trying to decipher its meaning. Was it a trap? A test? Or was Sarah simply twisting the knife, reminding him of how thoroughly he had misread the situation from the very beginning? Against his better judgment, he decided to attend. He told himself it was to show that he wasn't intimidated, that he could face her with dignity. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was drawn to her still, not with the possessive desire of before, but with something more complex. She had revealed herself to be his equal, no, his superior, in the very games he thought he had mastered. Part of him needed to see her again, to understand how he had been so completely outmaneuvered. The gala was held at the St. Regis, a glittering affair that brought together the city's financial elite. Marcus moved through the crowd with practiced ease, but his eyes constantly scanned for her. He found her by the bar, exactly where they had first met, and the parallel was clearly intentional. She wore a black gown that made her look like she had stepped out of a classic film, elegant and untouchable. When she saw him approaching, she smiled that knowing smile that had haunted his dreams. "Marcus," she said warmly, as if greeting an old friend. "I'm so glad you came." "Sarah." He nodded stiffly, unsure of the protocol for greeting someone who had destroyed you with such elegant efficiency. "You look well." "New York agrees with me," she said, sipping champagne. "Though I do miss some things about LA, the weather certainly, and the entertainment value of certain colleagues." Marcus felt heat rise in his face, but forced himself to remain calm. "I'm glad you found the transfer agreeable." "Oh, more than agreeable. Did you know your New York office was competing for the Jang Industries account? Such a fortunate coincidence that I was there to facilitate the introduction. The commission from that deal alone made the move worthwhile." The casualness with which she mentioned securing one of the most coveted accounts in commercial real estate felt like another perfectly placed dagger. Marcus had been trying to land Jang Industries for years without success. "Congratulations," he managed. Sarah studied him over the rim of her glass, her expression shifting to something almost sympathetic. "You know, Marcus, I should thank you." "Thank me?" "For the education. You see, I've been sheltered most of my life, protected. My father tried to tell me about men like you, but I needed to see it for myself. How you operate, how you view people as possessions to be acquired. It's been invaluable, really. I'll be able to spot your type from a mile away now." "And what type is that?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Sarah set down her glass and looked him directly in the eye. "The type who mistakes power for strength, who thinks control is the same as connection, who builds empires on the backs of people they see as lesser, never realizing those same people might be the ones holding the whole structure up." "You played me from the beginning," Marcus said, a statement rather than a question. "No," Sarah shook her head. "That's where you're wrong. I didn't play you at all. I simply was myself and let you reveal who you were. Every move you made, every manipulation you attempted, I documented. Did you know your office has security cameras? Amazing how much they capture when someone knows to request the footage." Marcus felt his knees weaken. Security footage of their interactions, taken out of context or even in context, would be damning. His reputation, already on shaky ground, would never recover. "Don't worry," Sarah continued, reading his expression. I have no intention of releasing anything. As I told my father, I prefer to handle my own affairs, but I keep it as insurance. You understand insurance, don't you, Marcus? What do you want from me? He asked for the second time in as many weeks. It was becoming a refrain, the anthem of his defeat. Nothing, Sarah said simply. That's what you never understood. I wanted nothing from you except professional respect and the chance to do good work. Everything that happened was because you couldn't accept that. You couldn't believe that a woman might be in your orbit without wanting to be possessed by you. A man approached them. Tall and distinguished with silver at his temples, he put a proprietary hand on Sarah's elbow, and she smiled up at him with genuine warmth. Marcus Williams, meet David Chen, my ex-husband. We've recently reconciled. Marcus shook the man's hand mechanically, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The maintained married name, the careful references to her past, all of it had been true, just incomplete. I've heard a lot about you, David said pleasantly, though his eyes were cold. Sarah tells me you were instrumental in her decision to transfer to New York. We're both grateful. The distance was hard on our relationship, but now that she's back... We should go, Sarah interjected smoothly. The auction is about to begin. Marcus, it was lovely to see you again. Do take care of yourself. As they walked away, David's hand at the small of Sarah's back in a gesture of easy intimacy, Marcus understood the full scope of his humiliation. Not only had he pursued a woman who was leagues above his reach in terms of power and connection, but he had done so while she was working to repair her marriage. Every advance he had made, every threat he had issued, had been against a woman who was never available to him in the first place. He left the gala early, driving through the Los Angeles streets in his Bentley that suddenly felt like a cage. Back in his penthouse, he poured himself a scotch and stood at the window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Sarah was probably laughing with her husband, sharing stories of the pathetic executive who had thought he could own her. The weeks that followed were an exercise in professional paranoia. Every lost deal, Marcus attributed to Zhang's influence. Every whispered conversation that stopped when he entered a room, he assumed was about his humiliation. Whether the persecution was real or imagined became impossible to distinguish. His leadership style, once commanding and decisive, became erratic. He oscillated between aggressive micromanagement and complete withdrawal. Senior executives began to quietly update their resumes. Board members started asking pointed questions about quarterly projections that were failing to materialize. Then came the audit. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, a team of federal investigators with boxes and warrants. They were polite but thorough, examining 5 years of financial records with particular interest in certain development projects. Marcus watched from his office as they methodically dismantled his carefully constructed financial architecture. His lawyer, Patterson, was blunt in his assessment. They're looking at potential tax irregularities in 3 of your offshore holdings. Nothing that can't be defended, but the process will be intensive and expensive and public. Zhang, Marcus said flatly. Patterson adjusted his glasses nervously. I can't speak to how this investigation was initiated, but I would advise focusing on mounting the strongest defense possible rather than speculating about its origins. But Marcus knew. This had Zhang's fingerprints all over it, not in any way that could be proven, of course. Just a word in the right ear, a suggestion to look in a particular direction. The beauty of true power was that it didn't need to be wielded directly. As the investigation dragged on, investors grew nervous. Stock prices for his publicly traded properties began to slide. The financial press, which had once celebrated him as a wunderkind, now ran headlines questioning his judgment and leadership. Marcus Williams, the man who had thought he owned the world, was watching that world crumble one audit at a time. 6 months after Sarah's revelation, Marcus sat in a conference room with his board of directors. They were discussing his future with the company, a polite way of negotiating his exit. The stress had aged him years in months. His hair, once perfectly styled, now showed gray at the temples. The confident swagger had been replaced by a defensive hunch. "We appreciate everything you've built here, Marcus," the board chairman said with false sympathy. "But given the current climate, we feel fresh leadership would benefit all stakeholders." Marcus didn't fight it. What was the point? He signed the separation agreement, accepted the golden parachute that was a fraction of what his stake had once been worth, and walked out of the building he had built without looking back. That evening, he received a package at his penthouse. Inside was a bottle of champagne, the same vintage he had ordered that night at his club, and a card. The message was brief. "To new beginnings. SZ." Marcus held the card for a long time, reading layers of meaning into those 4 words. Was it mockery, pity, or something else entirely? He opened the champagne and poured a glass, raising it to his reflection in the window. "To new beginnings," he repeated, the words bitter on his tongue. The man in the reflection was a stranger, hollow-eyed, diminished, stripped of the arrogance that had once defined him. Sarah hadn't just destroyed his career, she had shattered his entire sense of self. He had built his identity on power and control, never realizing how fragile those foundations were until someone with real power had blown on them gently and watched them collapse. As he sipped the champagne, Marcus thought about the last thing Sarah had said to him at the gala. "Take care of yourself." At the time, it had sounded like a pleasantry, the kind of thing people said when parting. Now he wondered if it had been advice, or perhaps a warning. Outside, Los Angeles glittered with the promise of 1,000 possibilities, 1,000,000 dreams waiting to be built or broken. Marcus had once felt like he owned this view, this city, this world. Now he understood that ownership was an illusion, that true power lay not in what you could take, but in what you could survive losing. The champagne was excellent, he had to admit. Sarah had good taste. Or perhaps it was her father who had selected it, one more reminder of the circles within circles of influence that Marcus had been too blind to see. Either way, the message was clear. They were watching. They would always be watching. And his continued existence was a courtesy extended at their discretion. Marcus finished the glass and considered his options. He could leave Los Angeles, start over somewhere else with the money he had left. He could try to rebuild, though the thought exhausted him. Or he could do what Sarah had suggested and take care of himself, not in the superficial way he always had, with designer suits and expensive toys, but in some deeper way he was only beginning to understand. The city lights blurred, as tears he hadn't realized were forming spilled down his cheeks. They weren't tears of self-pity or even regret. They were tears of recognition, of finally seeing himself as he truly was. A small man who had mistaken noise for strength, who had built an empire on foundations of sand and been surprised when the tide came in. In her own way, Sarah Zhang had given him a gift more valuable than anything his money could buy. She had shown him the truth about himself. What he did with that truth would determine whether he was capable of becoming something more than the hollow king of a crumbling castle. The champagne bottle sat on his granite countertop, a monument to his defeat and possibly, just possibly, a door to redemption. But that would depend entirely on choices yet to be made, on whether Marcus Williams could learn the lessons that Sarah Zhang had taught him with such devastating precision. As midnight approached, he made his first decision. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for his lawyer. But instead of calling about appeals or strategies for comeback, he sent a different message entirely. "Set up a meeting with the investigators. I want to come clean about everything." It wasn't courage that motivated him. It was exhaustion. The weight of maintaining his facade, of fighting battles he had already lost, was crushing. Sarah had destroyed him in seconds with the truth. Perhaps it was time he tried wielding that weapon himself. The city continued its restless pulse outside his window, indifferent to his epiphany. Somewhere in New York, Sarah was probably asleep beside her husband, her conscience clear, her future bright. She had played a game so subtle that Marcus hadn't even known he was losing until the final move. But perhaps that had been her greatest gift, showing him that there were games beyond the crude power plays he had mastered, games that required something more than money and influence to win. Marcus poured another glass of champagne, this time toasting not to new beginnings but to endings, to the death of who he had been and the uncertain birth of who he might become. The bubbles rose in the glass like tiny worlds being born and dying, and for the first time in months, Marcus Williams smiled. It was a broken smile, uncertain and painful, but it was real, and that, he supposed, was a start. 2 years had passed since Marcus Williams had signed his confession to federal investigators. The man who emerged from the courthouse after his sentencing bore little resemblance to the corporate titan who had once commanded boardrooms with imperial authority. 18 months in minimum security prison had stripped away the last vestiges of his former self, leaving behind someone quieter, more thoughtful, and infinitely more aware of his own insignificance in the grand scheme of things. The halfway house in downtown Los Angeles was a far cry from his former penthouse, but Marcus found an unexpected peace in its simplicity. His room contained a single bed, a small desk, and a window that faced a brick wall. There was no view of the city he had once thought he owned, and perhaps that was fitting. He had learned that the most dangerous view was the one that made you believe you stood above others. His days followed a routine that would have been unthinkable in his previous life. He woke at 5 a.m., not to check international markets or prepare for power breakfasts, but to help prepare meals at a homeless shelter 6 blocks away. It was part of his community service, but it had become something more. The men and women who lined up each morning didn't know who he had been, and he found liberation in their ignorance. "Morning, Mark," called James, one of the regulars, using the shortened name Marcus had adopted. "You making your famous scrambled eggs today?" "If you can call powdered eggs famous," Marcus replied, managing a genuine smile. It had taken months to learn how to smile without calculation, without agenda. The expression still felt foreign on his face sometimes, but it was getting easier. As he stirred the massive pan of eggs, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought him here. The federal investigation had uncovered more than tax irregularities. Like dominoes falling, each revelation had led to another. Bribery of city officials for zoning variances, kickbacks from construction contracts, a web of financial manipulation that had seemed like clever business when he was spinning it, but looked very different under the harsh light of legal scrutiny. His lawyers had argued for minimizing the damage, fighting each charge, dragging the process out for years, but Marcus had surprised them by refusing. He had pled guilty to everything, cooperating fully with investigators, providing evidence that led to the conviction of 3 city councilmen and a dozen other business figures who had been part of his network. The media had called it the most spectacular fall from grace in Los Angeles business history. The same magazines that had featured him on their covers now ran exposés on his crimes. The financial press dissected his empire's collapse with the same enthusiasm they had once reserved for praising its rise. But it was a letter he had received 6 months into his sentence that haunted him most. It had been forwarded through his lawyer, the return address showing a New York postmark. Inside, Sarah Zhang's handwriting was as elegant as everything else about her. "Marcus, I heard about your decision to cooperate with authorities. My father was surprised. He had expected you to fight to the bitter end, to cling to the remnants of your power until they were stripped from you by force. The fact that you chose differently suggests perhaps I misjudged you. I want you to know that neither my father nor I had anything to do with the investigation. We had decided to let karma handle you, and it seems it did. But your choice to face the truth, finally and fully, Shows a courage I didn't think you possessed. Don't mistake this letter for forgiveness. What you did to me, what you tried to do, is not something I'll forget. But I believe in redemption, in the possibility that people can change. I hope for your sake that you find whatever it is you were really looking for all along. S.Z. Marcus had read the letter so many times he had memorized every word. It sat now in the single drawer of his desk, the only memento from his past life that he had kept. Everything else, the cars, the watches, the art collection, had been sold to pay restitution and legal fees. "Mark, you okay?" The voice belonged to Diane, the shelter's director. She was a woman in her 60s who had run the facility for 20 years and had seen enough to not be easily fooled. "You've been stirring those eggs for 5 minutes. They're going to be rubber." "Sorry," Marcus said, refocusing on the task at hand. "Just thinking." "Dangerous habit," Diane said, but her tone was kind. She was one of the few who knew his real identity, having recognized him from news coverage. But she had never treated him differently because of it. "When you're done with breakfast, I need to talk to you about something." After the morning rush had passed and the dishes were cleaned, Marcus found Diane in her small office. The walls were covered with photos of people the shelter had helped over the years, success stories amid the struggle. "Sit," she instructed, gesturing to a folding chair. "I've been watching you for 6 months now, Mark. You show up early, stay late, never complain. The clients trust you, which isn't easy to earn. So I have a proposition." Marcus waited, having learned the value of silence. "My assistant director is retiring next month," Diane continued. "The pay is terrible, the hours are long, and the work is harder than anything you did in your boardrooms, but if you want it, the job is yours." The offer stunned him. "Diane, I'm a convicted felon. I destroyed people's savings, manipulated the system, hurt more people than I can count. Why would you trust me with anything?" "Because the man who did those things wouldn't have lasted a week here," Diane said simply. "He certainly wouldn't have spent 6 months serving eggs to homeless people without expecting anything in return. People change, Mark. The question is whether you believe you have." That night, Marcus sat in his small room, staring at the job offer Diane had written up. Assistant director of a homeless shelter, salary $32,000 a year. It was less than he used to spend on a watch. But as he looked at the simple document, he felt something he hadn't experienced in his years of building his empire: purpose. He accepted the position. The work was everything Diane had warned and more. Marcus found himself managing volunteers, coordinating with social services, writing grant proposals on an ancient computer that crashed regularly. He mediated disputes between clients, cleaned bathrooms when the janitor called in sick, and held the hands of men and women who had lost everything, an experience he understood more intimately than most. One evening, 3 months into his new role, Marcus was locking up the shelter when a familiar figure stepped out of a luxury car at the curb. David Chen, Sarah's husband, stood in an impeccable suit that probably cost more than Marcus now made in 3 months. "Mr. Williams," David said, his expression unreadable. "Or should I say Mark? I heard you were working here." Marcus straightened but didn't feel the old defensive tension. "David, this is unexpected. I'm in town for business. Sarah asked me to check on you." David's eyes scanned the shabby building, the graffiti-covered walls, the barred windows. "This is quite a change from your previous life." "Everything about my life has changed," Marcus said simply. "Did Sarah send you to gloat?" David smiled slightly. "Actually, no. She's genuinely curious about your transformation. She wonders if it's real or just another manipulation, a long con to rehabilitate your image." "What do you think?" Marcus asked. David studied him for a long moment. "I think you look like a different person. The arrogance is gone. The calculating look in your eyes has been replaced by something else. Exhaustion, maybe. Or peace. I'm not sure which. Both, Marcus admitted. Why did she really send you? David reached into his car and pulled out a manila envelope. She wanted me to give you this. Said you'd understand. After David's car disappeared into the Los Angeles traffic, Marcus opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. Sarah at what appeared to be a business conference, standing at a podium, commanding the room with the same quiet authority she had wielded so effectively against him. But it wasn't her presence that caught his attention. It was the banner behind her. Women in Business, Turning Adversity into Opportunity. On the back of the photo, she had written, "Your greatest mistake became my greatest lesson. Thank you for teaching me exactly who I never want to be. S.Z." Marcus looked at the photo for a long time, then carefully placed it in his wallet, not as a reminder of what he had lost, but of what he had learned. Sarah had destroyed his old life in seconds with her revelation, but in doing so, she had given him the opportunity to build something better from the ruins. Months passed. The shelter expanded its services under Marcus's quiet leadership. He wrote grants with the same attention to detail he had once applied to million-dollar deals. He negotiated with city officials for resources, using his knowledge of the system for good rather than exploitation. He created job training programs, leveraging contacts from his past life who were willing to give him a second chance. One particularly busy morning, Marcus was helping serve breakfast when he noticed a new face in line. The man was young, maybe 30, with the hollow look of someone who had recently lost everything. His clothes were expensive but dirty, the kind of disconnect that suggested a rapid fall from prosperity. As Marcus served him eggs, the young man looked up, and recognition flashed in his eyes. "You're Marcus Williams," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and confusion. "You built the Meridian Towers. I used to work in one of your buildings. What are you doing here?" "Working," Marcus said simply. "And it's just Mark now. What's your name?" "Thomas. Thomas Wright." The young man's voice cracked slightly. "I had a startup, raised $5 million in venture capital. I thought I was going to change the world. Then it all fell apart. My investors sued me. I lost everything. My wife left. I don't understand how it happened so fast." Marcus looked at the broken young man and saw a ghost of his former self. The same disbelief at how quickly power could evaporate. The same inability to comprehend a world that no longer bent to his will. "Sit down after you get your food," Marcus said. "I'll take my break and we can talk." They sat at one of the long tables, surrounded by others who had their own stories of loss and failure. Thomas poured out his story, the promising startup, the investors who had seemed so supportive until the first setback, the cascade of failures that had followed, each making the next inevitable. "I keep thinking I'll wake up," Thomas said, "that this is just a nightmare. I was somebody. I mattered. Now I'm nobody." "You were never somebody because of your startup," Marcus said carefully, "and you're not nobody now. You're the same person, just with fewer illusions. The question is what you do with that knowledge." "Easy for you to say," Thomas said bitterly. "You're Marcus Williams. Even working in a place like this, you still have your name, your reputation." Marcus almost laughed at the irony. "My name is synonymous with failure and corruption. My reputation is that of a cautionary tale. Everything I built is gone, and most of it deserved to go. The man you think I am doesn't exist anymore. Maybe he never really did." He told Thomas his story, the whole truth of it. Sarah Zhang, the investigation, the prison time, the complete destruction of everything he had once valued. Thomas listened with growing amazement. "So she destroyed you," Thomas said when Marcus finished, "just like that." "In seconds." "No," Marcus corrected. "I destroyed myself over years. She just showed me the truth of it. And in a way, I'm still understanding. That was the greatest gift anyone ever gave me." Thomas looked around the shelter, at the volunteers serving food, at the clients eating with dignity despite their circumstances. And now you're here. Now I'm here, Marcus agreed, doing work that actually matters, making less in a year than I used to spend on lunch, and sleeping better than I have in 20 years. They talked for another hour. Marcus connected Thomas with resources, gave him practical advice about navigating the social services system, and offered him volunteer opportunities at the shelter. As Thomas left, he turned back. "Do you ever think about revenge? Against Sarah Zhang?" Marcus considered the question. "She gave me the only thing my money couldn't buy, the truth about myself." "How do you take revenge against someone who gave you a gift like that?" That evening, Marcus received an unexpected call. His assistant director position required him to occasionally speak with major donors, and he assumed this was another such call. But the voice on the other end made him freeze. "Hello, Marcus. Or should I say Mark?" Sarah Zhang's voice was exactly as he remembered, controlled, confident, with that hint of amusement that suggested she knew more than she was saying. "Sarah." He managed to keep his voice steady despite the way his heart was racing. "This is unexpected. I'm in Los Angeles for a conference. David mentioned he saw you a while ago. I thought perhaps we could meet. There's something I'd like to discuss." They arranged to meet at a small coffee shop near the shelter, neutral ground that belonged to neither of their worlds. Marcus arrived early, ordering a simple black coffee and choosing a table in the corner. When Sarah walked in, she looked exactly as she had at the gala 2 years ago, polished, professional, completely in control. "You look different," she said as she sat down, studying him with those dark eyes that missed nothing. "Older, tired, but also lighter somehow." "Prison and poverty will do that," Marcus said, attempting humor. Sarah didn't smile. "I've been following your work at the shelter. What you've built there in the past year is impressive. The job training program particularly. Using your old business contacts to create opportunities for people, it's clever." "It's necessary," Marcus corrected. "These people need more than food and a bed. They need hope. They need to believe they can be more than their worst moment." "Is that what you believe? That you're more than your worst moment?" Marcus considered the question. "I believe I'm trying to be. Every day. Some days I succeed, some days I don't. But I keep trying." Sarah nodded slowly. "I owe you an apology." The words were so unexpected that Marcus nearly dropped his coffee. "What?" "I played with you," Sarah said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "Yes, you deserved consequences for your behavior. Yes, you needed to be stopped. But I took pleasure in your destruction. I enjoyed watching you realize how powerless you were. That wasn't justice. That was cruelty." "You weren't cruel," Marcus protested. "You were defending yourself." "I was doing more than that. And we both know it." Sarah's fingers traced patterns on the table, the first nervous gesture he had ever seen from her. "I wanted to break you, not just stop you, but completely destroy your sense of self. And I succeeded. The question that's haunted me is whether I became you in the process, someone who uses power to dominate rather than protect." Marcus sat in silence, processing this revelation. Sarah Zhang, the woman who had seemed invincible, was questioning her own actions. The symmetry was not lost on him. "What do you want me to say?" he asked finally. "That I forgive you? That what you did was justified? I can't give you absolution, Sarah. I'm still figuring out how to forgive myself." "I don't want absolution," Sarah said. "I want to know if it's possible to wield power without becoming corrupted by it." "You've seen both sides now. What do you think?" Marcus thought about the question, about his years of dominance and his current life of service. "I think power is like fire. It can warm you or consume you, and the line between the two is thinner than most people realize. The only protection is remembering that you're not the flame. You're just someone standing close to it." Sarah smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes without calculation. That's very philosophical for someone who used to communicate mainly in profit margins. I've had time to think, Marcus said. Prison gives you that. They talked for another hour, not as predator and prey or victim and vanquisher, but as two people who had played a dangerous game and were trying to understand what it had cost them. Sarah told him about her work in New York, about the women she mentored who faced harassment and manipulation in corporate settings. Marcus shared stories from the shelter, the small victories and daily struggles that now filled his life. As they prepared to leave, Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a check. The amount made Marcus's eyes widen. It was more than the shelter's annual budget. "This isn't charity," she said, placing it on the table between them. "Consider it an investment. I've researched your programs. They work. They change lives. I want to fund the expansion you outlined in your last grant proposal." "Sarah, I can't." "Yes, you can," she interrupted. "Not for you. For them. For Thomas Wright and all the others who need what you're building. Pride is another form of power, Mark. Don't let it control you." Marcus picked up the check with hands that trembled slightly. "Why are you really doing this?" Sarah stood, gathering her things with the same elegant efficiency she brought to everything. "Because destruction is easy. Anyone with power can tear things down. Building something better from the ruins, that's the real test. You're passing that test. I want to help." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Mark? My father sends his regards. He's been quite interested in your transformation. He says that a man who can face the truth about himself is rarer than any fortune. I'm starting to think he might be right." As she walked away, Marcus sat alone with the check that would transform the shelter's ability to serve its community. He thought about the strange journey that had brought him here, from the man who had tried to own Sarah Zhang to the man who now understood that true power lay not in possession, but in purpose. That night, Marcus called a meeting with Diane and the shelter's board to share the news of the donation. As he watched their faces light up with the possibilities it represented, he felt something he had never experienced in all his years of closing deals and building empires: genuine joy in other people's success. Later, alone in his small room, Marcus pulled out the photo Sarah had sent him months ago. He looked at it differently now, understanding that her success had not come at his expense, but parallel to his journey. They had both been transformed by their encounter, shaped by the collision of their worlds into people neither of them had expected to become. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When he opened it, he found a simple message. "The best revenge is a life well lived. Thank you for showing me that's true. S.Z." Marcus smiled, a real smile that would have been foreign to the man he used to be. He typed back, "The best redemption is a life lived in service. Thank you for showing me the way." He put the phone aside and began working on plans for the shelter's expansion. There were people to help, programs to build, lives to change. The man who had thought he could own the world had learned that the only thing worth possessing was purpose. And in losing everything he had once valued, Marcus Williams had found the one thing his money had never been able to buy: himself. Outside his window, Los Angeles glowed with its eternal promise, the same city where he had built and lost an empire. But Marcus no longer saw it as territory to be conquered. He saw it as a community to be served, full of people like Thomas Wright, who needed to discover that their worst moments didn't have to define them. Sarah Zhang had destroyed him in seconds with her revelation. But from that destruction had come something neither of them had anticipated: the possibility of grace. And that, Marcus thought, as he worked late into the night on plans that would help people he once wouldn't have noticed, was the most unexpected revelation of all. The story that had begun with a man who thought he could own a woman had become something entirely different: a testament to the power of truth, the possibility of change, and the strange ways that destruction could sometimes lead to creation. Marcus Williams, the corporate titan, was gone forever. But Mark, the man who served eggs to the homeless and wrote grants to fund hope, had just begun. And somewhere in New York, Sarah Zhang continued her own work, carrying the lessons of their encounter into boardrooms where she protected other women from men like Marcus used to be. They would probably never meet again, but they were connected now by something deeper than the power games that had brought them together. They were connected by the understanding that sometimes the greatest strength came from admitting weakness, and the greatest victory came from choosing not to fight at all. The revelation that had destroyed Marcus Williams in seconds had taken years to fully understand. But in that understanding lay the seed of everything that mattered: redemption, purpose, and the hard-won wisdom that the only person anyone could ever truly own was themselves. And that, in the end, was enough.